Hola, welcome to the Chicana Therapist podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Xochitl Alamillo, and today we're going to be talking about grief. I, as a therapist, often feel like I'm a bummer because I talk about emotions and grief and other things that are not fun and joyful. But I do talk about a lot of necessary things, so here we are. So I recently finished teaching grief and loss to master's level social workers. And what struck me, even after so many years of doing clinical work, a lot of which revolves around grief, is how much we don't talk about it and how much people really don't know, not really, what it might look like or what's helpful, what's not helpful. So today we're going to talk about grief. Yes, we're going to talk about, the grief that we mostly think of when we hear the word, which is losing someone to death. But briefly, I also want to talk about duelo que no se nombra, the grief that doesn't get named. So hopefully today you walk away knowing what are some things you want to avoid saying to people who are experiencing grief, what are some of the things that you do want to do, and some other things about grief. So thank you for being here. So let's start with what grief actually is. So yes, when we think about grief, we mostly think about death. And yes, absolutely, that is the type of grief that I think we all know about and what we think about when we hear the word grief. But grief can be so much bigger than that. Grief is the response to any significant loss. And loss can come in many forms. It can come in forms that sometimes we don't acknowledge even for ourselves. So yes, there's the grief of losing a loved one to death, and that can be family, that can be pets, that can be friends. There's also the grief, and I have talked about this type before on the podcast, the grief of a friendship that ended, the grief of losing someone to drastic change. There's the grief of a marriage dissolving, the grief that you experience when you let your dreams go or when you realize that you won't be able to continue pursuing a dream for whatever reason. There's grief of leaving your home, whether that's your home country or an actual house, moving to another house, losing community if you move away from that community. You even grieve a version of yourself that existed before. One of the things that I mention to people who become parents is that can be as joyful as it could be to have a child and all of that. There can also be a lot of grief involved. We don't think about this a lot, but being childless, there is grief attached to it. And grief doesn't mean that you're devastated because it's gone, but it just means that there is a response to now being someone who's depended on, and it's your responsibility to keep someone alive and happy and healthy. And you miss the version of yourself that didn't have that, or the single part of yourself. Yes, you can even experience some grief when you get married or when you get in a serious relationship. I know that those sound like, why are we talking about that? But that can legit be a reason. And it is one of the reasons people feel dismissed when they can feel joy for where they are now, but also experience some grief about who they used to be. And you can even feel grief for something that you never had. I talk to a lot of people who experience grief when they realize that they will never have the relationship that they dreamed about with their parents, with their mom, with their dad, or even with their sibling. When they make that realization that it takes two to contribute to a relationship, and they realize that they've tried and it's just not going to work, they experience grief over that. So in the clinical world, we talk about different types of grief. There's ambiguous grief or ambiguous loss. Ambiguous loss is when someone is physically present, or one type of it is when someone is physically present but emotionally or cognitively absent. So for example, like if someone has dementia, or even with addiction, when they're so deep into their addiction that their body is here, but emotionally or cognitively they're not here. And then there's the other type of ambiguous loss where there is no physical presence, but there's an emotional presence. For example, a missing person. As far as you know, they are alive, but you don't know where they are. Or incarceration. they are incarcerated, so you are not with them. You maybe not have that much contact with them, but they are alive. Divorce is another one that could count as this because they're here, they're not gone, but you don't have that emotional connection anymore. So ambiguous grief can be like you've not really lost the person, but you've lost something in regards to the person, whether that's their physical body or their mind or emotions or psychologically. And there's also what we call disenfranchised grief. And I would say that this might be one of the cruelest forms because it can feel isolating in your own pain. So disenfranchised grief means a loss that is not publicly acknowledged or it's not accepted by society. And that might be because society fails to recognize this as a loss, or the relationship is unrecognized, or kind of when I hear people say, like, I feel like I don't have a right to grieve this person. So for example, you get divorced and you haven't spoken to your ex-partner, but then they pass away and you grieve that loss. That could be considered a disenfranchised grief type because, society might be like, well, you didn't want them, so you divorced them, or whatever the case may be. Another example might be not so much recently, but maybe in the Latinx community, this like when people deeply grieve their pets, and sometimes you hear people say, but it was just a dog, or it was just a cat, or whatever the case may be. That can also be considered disenfranchised grief, or just something that you wouldn't necessarily be given grace by society. This could be an abortion. This could be a miscarriage. This could be losing a home, a job, not being able to get pregnant, or grieving that maybe you become disabled and you grieve that. So I know some of these that I'm mentioning, you would be like, oh, I would totally understand that. Yes, and they are things that maybe not everyone would agree would be a reason to grieve. So that might be something that we call disenfranchised grief. And when you think about it, maybe when you lose a person, a loved one, you might get a funeral, you might get a card from people. But disenfranchised grief often is not something that people will do that for, or you don't get to participate in that, or you're not getting the cards because it's not widely considered a form of acceptable, quote unquote, grief. And so that's why I meant like it can be really isolating. It can be really lonely to experience disenfranchised grief. So in our community, in our Latinx community, grief is complicated by culture in many ways, in both beautiful ways, but also painful ways. So let me start with the beautiful because I don't want us to only see the hard parts. We have beautiful rituals. They may or may not be associated with religion, for example, and they also may not be exclusive to the Latinx community. We have velorios. There's the wake, the gathering, usually around a person's physical body when they pass away. There's often a lot of community. There's often music. It's not unheard of to hear a mariachi at a velorio. There's food. There's prayer. Some people still do this. They stay up through the night with their loved one. We also have, for those of you that are Catholic, have the novenario, the 9 days of prayer and community presence that hold like the grieving family as something, just hold them close and pray with them for 9 straight days. I think that is a beautiful practice to have people come and sit with you for 9 straight days and be in community and show your support. We have Dia de Muertos. It's an entire tradition built around keeping our loved ones close. People build altares. They set out their loved one's favorite food, photos, things. And, this can range from anything from sitting in the cemetery that day, or those of us who may be far from our loved ones that are buried might have our own celebrations. I think those are beautiful. We also have the smaller kind of rituals or practices like throwing the fistful of dirt on top of the coffin. So that physical participation in a goodbye that is just so honest and just beautiful. So as a community, I think in general, we show up, right? We show up, we bring food, we stay, we sit with people. And I think these traditions exist because our ancestors understood that grief needs community. You grieve in community, we hold each other up, that you cannot and should not grieve alone. I think these are gifts, and I think they're beautiful things that we practice. And there's many, many more practices that you might have in your family or your particular community or wherever you're from. I think that these are some beautiful ways of showing support. But then there's other side. And again, this is not exclusive to the Latinx community, but this idea of telling people, hay que ser fuerte, you have to be strong, especially with our men, because sometimes we don't know what to say. And so we end up telling people like, stay strong, tú eres fuerte, tú puedes, which there's nothing inherently wrong with telling someone that. But if you think about it, sometimes the message is you can't be anything other than something perceived to be strong. And so some people could interpret that to mean like, oh, you shouldn't cry, you shouldn't grieve. And I think that suppression or encouragement of silence, even if it's unintentional, can be really harmful. I have heard stories of mostly men who, once their person passes away, they never speak of them. And not because it's a cultural thing or anything, but I especially have heard a few of my younger clients that I've had in the past, maybe their mother passed away and their dad is raising them, but their dad never mentions their mom or the grief that they have for their mom or anything like that. And when asked, why do you think that your dad does that? I often heard, because I think it hurts too much, or he doesn't want to seem weak. He wants to seem strong. And I think that's a pretty common narrative in Latino men. Or they dealt with their grief by being angry or distant or picking up alcohol or drugs. And I'm not saying this is the whole story, but I do think that sometimes from boyhood, these men are taught that grief is not something that a man does out loud. Grief being crying, being sad, missing someone, that kind of thing. And there's a difference between being strong and suppression in general, especially because a suppressed grief does not just go away. Just because you're not demonstrating your grief, just because it goes underground, or just because you don't talk about things or show things, that doesn't mean that that's not going to come out in some way, shape, or form. It's going to come out in your body or in your relationships or, just the way you interact with people. And I can't tell you how many times I've had grown, middle-aged, but also older adults in therapy grieving a loss that they had when they were children because they were never able to deal with that. They were never able to grieve. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't be crying or sad about a loss you had as a child, but they've never processed it. And so I do want to say that I think sometimes in our desire to be helpful and supportive, we can say things that are not, in fact, helpful. And that leads me to what not to say to a grieving person. And this might make a few of you uncomfortable because I think that when I'm teaching this or when I'm giving a talk about this and I mention this, people kind of side eye, look at each other like, oh shit, I've said some of these things. I just want to put out there that people who say hurtful things to grieving people are not trying to hurt them. They're trying to help. They're trying to be supportive. Usually they're just uncomfortable with grief, which again is a whole deeper problem. So they'll reach for the first thing that feels like it might make the pain smaller, or they're uncomfortable with grief. And so they do the first thing that makes them feel better as opposed to thinking about what would make their person feel better. And good intentions don't cancel out the impact. So I want to talk about what not to say and why. So one of the things I hear a lot is the person wouldn't want you to cry. That needs to be retired permanently. You don't know that. And even if it were true, the grieving person's tears are not about what the person who died would want. They are about the person in front of you who is in pain, who needs to feel that pain and not have to feel like they have to perform composure for the comfort of everyone around them. And then there's one of my least favorite. Everything happens for a reason. And this one is very dismissive, in my opinion. It implies that the loss was somehow necessary, that it was cosmically justified, and it asked the grieving person to make meaning before they're ready to do that. If the person comes to that conclusion, if they believe, for example, I hear people say, I feel like God knew what he's doing or something like that, that's on them, but it's not on you to put it on them. Grief doesn't need a reason. It just needs space. And so telling someone everything happens for a reason is very like, why are you crying? There's actually a reason for this. I don't know how else to explain it. Unfortunately, I have been around grieving mothers who have lost their children. And one of the things that I've heard people say directly or indirectly is, you have other kids to think about. And that really rubs me the wrong way, because when a parent is grieving a child, they're not dividing their love. It's not like the grief for one child will cancel out the love that they have for the other. And it's not like someone in the depth of their loss needs to be reminded of all their responsibilities. You think they don't know? They know that. And another one that I hear a lot, and I might even be guilty of having said this at some point, and I also hear a lot of men say this to each other when it comes to grief. Así es la vida. That's life. Like, meh, you know, I know that they're trying to convey acceptance, but again, it feels dismissive. Yes, loss is part of life, but that doesn't make it hurt any less. That doesn't mean we rush past it. It doesn't mean that we just, hope. That's life, ni modo. And one that I despise, and I see it a lot in social media comments when someone posts about a loss that they had, is, I know exactly how you feel. That is one of my clinical pet peeves, but not just for loss, but for anything. But when someone posts, hey, I lost a parent, and someone says, I know exactly how you feel. I lost my parent last year. I know it's not ill-intended, but every loss is deeply personal. And even if you've experienced a similar loss, it's not the same, and you don't know how they feel. And I've talked to many people throughout my career and my life that have lost someone and have been told this, and it's infuriating because you're centering yourself in something that has nothing to do with you. And I know that it's meant to, hey, let me normalize or validate, but you don't need to do that. There's also the at least crowd. And again, I might have been guilty of this at some point, well, at least they didn't suffer, which isn't always like a negative thing to say. I think it's all about timing, but at least they lived a long life, or at least they didn't suffer, or at least you didn't have to see them sick in bed or whatever. I hear more than anything, I hear people say this to themselves to comfort themselves. But it's usually, you want to be careful about when you're telling someone else when you're not the person that's grieving. And of course, as I mentioned before, you need to be strong. Tú eres fuerte, tú puedes. Again, it's about timing. Are you being dismissive? Or are you saying, I need you to seem strong because I don't like it when you look weak, because then I feel some kind of way. So these are some of the phrases that we want to avoid saying to people. And we want to really step away from doing anything or saying anything that feels like your tears are making me uncomfortable. And so I'm going to say something right now to hopefully make you feel better so you can act normal-ish. Right? All right. So I came after the people who've said things like that. Like I said, if this has been you before, we get it. It's not intentional, but when you know better, you do better. So now what do you say or how do you support a grieving person? Because I know that a lot of us really genuinely want to show up for the people we love, and sometimes we just don't know how. So first, and I learned this from attending like velorios and things like this, like presence over performance. You do not need to know what to say. In fact, I can guarantee you that almost nothing that you do say is helpful. It might not be unhelpful, but it's also not helpful because somebody just lost a loved one. So what matters is that you show up and that you stay and you just sit with people. Let them cry. Let them talk about the person they lost or not, or sit in silence. You just follow their lead. Presence. I know sometimes, especially those of us who like to be helpful and like to do this and that, feel like that's not enough, but I promise you that it is, and it's meaningful. Second thing you can do to be supportive is be specific with your offers. I know that oftentimes, again, I'm guilty of this sometimes, is let me know if you need anything. And that sounds supportive, and you really do mean it, but it puts the burden on the person grieving to ask you to do things, which most of us, let's be honest, especially Latinas, we will not do. So what I suggest instead that we do, say, hey, I'm bringing you dinner on Thursday. What time works for you? Or, hey, I'm going to bring you dinner one day this week. Which day do you prefer? Or depending on the relationship you have with the person, hey, I'm picking up your kids from school this week. Which days do you want me to pick them up? Be specific. Be actionable. Do not require them to ask you to do anything. Just maybe give them options of what feels comfortable. But again, it depends on how close you are to the person. If it's your best friend, be like, hey, I'm coming over to do your laundry, or I'm coming over to clean your house. Don't do that if you don't know the person like that. But, things like that are much more helpful and specific. And sometimes people are like, no, you don't have to do that. But it's like, I'm not actually giving you a choice. You have to eat, so I'm sending you dinner. Third, I would say one of the hardest things I've heard from people who've experienced major death loss is that it's very healing for them to experience the community that comes around them, around the funeral, the novenario, the wake, all of that. But then when all that stops, everyone, poof, just completely disappears. So it's normal that when someone passes, the first week after a loss, the first couple of weeks, people show up, they bring food, they bring all these things. But right around week 3 or 4, everyone just kind of goes back to their lives, which is, of course, what they're supposed to do. But the grieving person is still struggling, and the shock has worn off, and they now have to live with the fact that their loved one is not around anymore, and very few people check in. So my suggestion is to check in a month later, 3 months later, on the anniversary of their loved one's death or their birthday, and if you're ADHD like me and you really want to show up, but your memory is terrible, write it down, put it on your calendar. It still counts, because I really do want to be there for people. And I'm sure you do too. And so some people are like, well, if I didn't remember, that means I'm terrible. No, write it down. And last but not least, don't be afraid to talk about the person that was lost. Don't avoid mentioning them. Don't go out of your way to pretend they never existed. Because sometimes we do this because we're afraid of upsetting the person. We'll bring up the person and we think they're going to cry, which if they do, that's fine. Crying is not bad. Believe me, they are already thinking about them. Every single minute they think about their loved one. So you saying their name doesn't bring the pain back or flooding in. It actually, for a lot of people, brings relief. Like, it touches them that you remember them and you're still willing to keep their memory alive. So I want to end this episode by telling you that if you are the person grieving a death, you are allowed to take as long as you need. There is no timeline. Grief isn't a problem to be solved. I sometimes have had clients think like I should have gotten over this by now, and that's not a thing. It's actually a process to be moved through, and it's always at its own pace, not anyone else's. There's nothing in the science literature that says it should take someone exactly 6 months to get over their partner's death. That doesn't exist. And if you are grieving something that doesn't have a name, that maybe is, like I mentioned, an ambiguous loss or disenfranchised loss, a version of yourself, a dream, your country, or something that ended without closure, just know that grief is also real and it also counts, and you are allowed to mourn it even if no one else understands what you lost. And if you are someone who was taught that grief is weakness, or that crying is embarrassing, or that the only way that you can demonstrate strength is by moving on quickly, I want to offer a different framing for you. Grief is not weakness. Grief is love with nowhere to go. I've heard that said before, and I love that. It deserves somewhere to go. And that might be a conversation that you have with loved ones. It could be with a therapist. It could be a journal. It could be however you want it. Find somewhere to put it. I always encourage people who were not able to have a grieving ritual to come up with their own. Your nervous system actually will appreciate that. It doesn't have to be some well-established ritual. You can decide what your mourning will look like. And if you love someone who is grieving, because I think at some point we all do, just know you don't have to fix it. All you have to do is stay and be present. Gracias for being here. This topic is really close to my heart. As a clinician, I see it so much in my clients. As a teacher, I love to teach it. And as someone who has known loss in many forms, thank you so much for being here. And if this episode resonated with you, please share it with someone who might need it. And if you're in the middle of your own grief right now, just know that I see you and it is a process. I also want to remind you that if you are interested in my upcoming Oaxaca Retreat, my friend Claudia and I, both therapists, are offering a trip for Latinas to Oaxaca in September of this year. Please go to my website and click on retreats at thechicanatherapist.com. We only have 2 spots out of 15 left, so don't hesitate. It's going to be an amazing time. Also, humbly ask that if you haven't yet rated this podcast, it will make it easier for people to see it and share it. And thank you again. Cuídense mucho. I'll see you on the next episode. Thank you for listening. This podcast is intended for educational and informational purposes only. Nothing shared in this podcast constitutes therapy, clinical advice, or a therapeutic relationship. Listening to this podcast does not establish a provider-client relationship, and if you're experiencing a mental health crisis or in need of clinical support, please contact a licensed mental health professional or call or text 988 Crisis Hotline.